Out in a leaning old barn in eastern Kentucky, a fella clearing his granddad's place found a dusty glass jar tucked on a shelf, wired up to a crank telephone hanging on the wall. He gave the crank a turn, half expecting nothing. The bell rang. That jar still had juice in it. Now think about what your gear does. A lithium pack that cost you $400 loses a third of its punch the first hard cold snap, swells up, and quits on you in 5-6 years. That's the deal we all made. Power when the grid holds, and a fat bill when it doesn't. That jar got wired up in the spring of 1912. By the winter of 1948, it was still ringing that phone on maybe $5 of parts. 36 years, no charger, no replacement. But before I show you what those old-timers were pouring into a mason jar, you've got to understand why every battery you own today is quietly designed to fail you. Here's what wears on anybody living off the grid. Lithium hates the cold. Drop below freezing and you can't even charge it safe, and the capacity just melts away. Lead acid, the old standby in the shed, wants babying, topping off, and it sulfates up if you let it sit too low for too long. And they all die on a clock. A good lithium bank gives you maybe 8 to 10 years if you're gentle. Cheap lead acid, 3 to 5. Then you're back out $600, $2,000, whatever the bank charges that year, hauling dead weight to the recycler and starting over. It adds up to a truth nobody selling batteries will say out loud. You are renting your power, and the lease never ends. But there was another way, cheaper and longer lasting than anything on a store shelf today. Up in the hollows, folks solved this 100 years back, and they did it before the power company ever ran a single wire up the mountain. Picture the mountains around 1910. No poles marching up the ridges, no meter on the porch. If a family wanted a telephone to reach the next farm or fetch the doctor, they strung the line themselves, fence post to fence post, spool of wire and a pair of pliers, running it clean across the ridgetops. But a telephone needs steady current sitting there every hour, ready when you crank it, not for a day, for years, and there was no store to run to, no wall outlet, no charger in a drawer. The nearest town might be a half-day's wagon ride down a mud road. So think on the problem they had. Electricity that never quit, that fed a line day and night through every winter, with nobody around to tend it and nothing to plug it into. Sounds impossible. The thing that fed those lines wasn't a windmill, and it wasn't a generator. It was sitting quiet on a shelf, and one man in New Jersey did not want it catching on. Back in the 1890s, Thomas Edison was pouring money into his own storage battery, a nickel and iron alkaline cell he wanted in every home, every car, every trackside signal box. He was fighting Westinghouse over whose current would light the country, and the man who owned the batteries owned the future. So a cheap wet cell that any farmer could throw together on a workbench wasn't just competition, it was a hole in the whole plan. And this thing was cheap. No rare metals, no factory, no patent to license. A few common parts and some blue crystals you could order from a catalog for pocket change, and you had power that didn't quit. That's the part that still gets me. It wasn't some lost genius invention locked in a vault. It was almost embarrassingly simple. Simple enough that keeping folks from noticing was easier than fighting it head-on. To see why it scared him, you have to look at what people kept finding in abandoned cabins clear into the 1970s. Country folks poking around old homesteads kept turning up the same thing. A heavy glass jar, maybe a gallon, sitting in the corner of a barn, or the basement of a shut-down train depot. Inside, 2 liquids that never mixed, a deep blue pooled at the bottom and clear sitting on top, with a line between them clean as oil on water. Down in that blue sat a chunk of copper. Up top hung a strip of zinc, chewed and crusted from years of work. Railroad sheds had rows of them wired together, coated in dust an inch thick, wires long since gone brittle. And here's what stopped people cold. Some of these jars, left alone for 40, 50 years, still ticked a needle when you touched a meter to them. A dead battery from before the Model T, still faintly breathing. That blue layer wasn't decoration. It was doing the one job every expensive battery you buy today does badly. Think about what a battery normally has to fight. The two halves want to mix, the reaction wants to run wild, so we seal them up tight and hope the case holds. This old cell did the opposite. It let the two solutions sit right there in the same open jar and just trusted them to stay apart. The trick was weight. One solution was heavier than the other, so it sank and stayed put, like syrup under water. That heavy layer cradled one metal, the light layer cradled the other, and the boundary between them did the work a factory-sealed membrane does in a modern cell. No lid, no pressure, no danger of it venting fumes in your face. Because nothing was sealed, nothing built up. It didn't gas off, didn't swell, didn't need babying. You could leave it on a shelf, come back a year later, and it was right where you left it, ready to give. Get that separation wrong, though, and you don't get free power. You get a ruined jar and a lesson the old-timers learned the hard way. The whole secret of this cell was that it let two liquids sit still and refuse to mix. So the fastest way to kill it was to move it. Stir the jar, tilt it too far, or knock it off the shelf, and those two layers folded into each other like cream in coffee. Once they mixed, the cell was done, and no amount of coaxing brought it back. Overloading did the same damage slower. Pull too much current, too fast, and you churned the liquids from the inside, blurring that quiet line the old-timers worked so hard to protect. Folks who ran a big load off one small jar wondered why their power faded in a week. Then there was the copper wire feeding out the top. Let it dip down into the wrong layer, or leave bare metal where it shouldn't be, and corrosion crept in and ate the connection. A little sloppiness cost you the jar. Handle it right, and this same setup did something the phone companies relied on for 50 straight years. Before the power lines reached the hollows, the telephone companies had a problem. They needed steady current at little country exchanges, out past any wall socket, and they needed it to last. These jars answered that call. Rows of them sat in back rooms and on switchboard shelves, humming along quietly, year after year. The railroads leaned on them too. Signal boxes strung out along miles of track, far from any town, ran on these same cells to keep the lights and relays working. A lineman might swing by once or twice a year, top off the jar, and move on down the line. That's the part that stops you. 50 years of service on a setup that asked for nothing but a handful of cheap refills. No charger, no maintenance man, no factory. And here's the part I've been circling this whole time. Everything that cell needed, you can still buy at a feed store and a hardware store for about $5. They called it the gravity cell. Old-timers around here knew it as the crowfoot cell, named for the shape of the copper piece that sat down in the bottom of the jar. Simple name, simple thing, and it did what no battery on the shelf today will do for you. It never needed charging from an outside source. It ran on nothing but chemistry, gravity, and time. You didn't plug it in, you didn't baby it, and it didn't care if the grid was up or down. When a cell weakened, you didn't throw it out, you fed it a little more of what it started with. That's the promise sitting in front of us now. Cheap parts, no wall power, and a working life measured in decades instead of months. So let's build one the way the old-timers did. Copper on the bottom, and something you'd never guess sitting up top. Start with a wide glass jar. An old half-gallon canning jar does the job just fine. Down at the bottom you set your copper piece, a coil or a star-shaped plate, and pour a good handful of copper sulfate right over it. That blue stuff sold as root killer for about $5 a bag. Up top you hang the zinc, cast in that spidery shape the old-timers called a crowfoot, so its legs straddle the rim and dangle down into the plain water you fill over top. A copper wire runs off each metal and up through the lid. Now the quiet magic. That copper sulfate dissolves and settles low because it's heavier, holding a deep blue pool along the bottom while clear liquid floats above it. That line between them, sharp as oil on water, is the whole battery. Copper down in the blue, zinc up in the clear, and current pulling steady between the two. But a jar that makes power is only half of it. The reason it ran for decades is what happened while nobody was watching. Here's why it lasted so long. As the cell works, the zinc up top slowly gives itself away, and copper down below plates right back onto the copper element, thickening it instead of wearing it out. A slow, steady draw keeps that blue line sitting exactly where it belongs, feeding copper back in about as fast as it's pulled out. Leave it running a small load, a telegraph sounder, a doorbell, a trickle of light, and the chemistry holds its own balance day and night. Stop drawing power, and the blue creeps upward and muddies the clear layer. So oddly enough, these cells liked a little honest work to stay healthy. The upkeep was almost nothing. Once a year you'd top off the water that evaporated, drop in a fresh handful of copper sulfate crystals, and skim off the white zinc crust that gathered up top. Do that little bit, and the same jar kept right on humming. Once you understand that, you start seeing where a few of these old cells are quietly still working right now. You'll still find them, if you know where to look. Telegraph and railroad buffs keep gravity cells running to power those old sounders the honest way. And a handful of off-grid tinkerers build little banks of them in mason jars to run a clock, a radio, or a string of low-draw LEDs off nothing but copper, zinc, and blue crystals. But I'll be straight with you. One cell puts out about a volt, maybe a volt and a little, and just a small trickle of current. It won't run your well pump, your icebox, or light a whole cabin, no matter how many jars you wire together without a world of fuss. So it's not a house battery, and truth is it never was. It's a patient, low-power workhorse, happiest with a tiny, steady load and a job that just never quits. Knowing its limits is exactly what tells you the one place on your homestead it still beats a battery you'd pay $100 for. Start where the cell's already winning. A gravity cell puts out about a volt, and it loves a load that sips instead of gulps. Think a doorbell that rings twice a day, a barn buzzer, a little relay that trips a light when the henhouse door swings open. Want to run a small radio or a low-draw sensor through the whole winter? Wire the jars in series. 4 cells stacked give you roughly 4 volts, 6 get you close to 6, and the current stays gentle the whole way. That steady, unhurried draw is exactly what keeps the copper building instead of burning out. Keep them somewhere the temperature holds, a cellar shelf or a corner of the barn that never freezes, and top off the water when the level drops. Match the job to the jar, and it'll carry a tiny circuit clean through the cold months without a charger, a panel, or a single dollar of grid power. Which brings me back to that jar in the barn, and the one small thing about the man who built it that changes this whole story. So there it is, $5 in copper, zinc, and blue vitriol, 2 liquids that sort themselves by weight and never mix, and a jar that hums along for decades while the fancy stuff dies in a drawer. Edison had a horse in that race, and a cell this cheap and this stubborn was bad for business, so it slid quietly out of the story. But here's the part that stuck with me. The old-timer who first wired that barn cell couldn't read a schematic to save his life. He learned it from a railroad man passing through, scratched the steps onto the back of a feed sack, and that sack was still tacked to the barn wall the day his grandkids found the jar. Ink faded, corners curled, the whole recipe hanging there in the dark the entire time. That's the thing about these old skills. They don't vanish because they stopped working. They vanish because nobody bothered to keep them lit. If a jar of blue water can outlast a century, the least we can do is pass the knowing along. Stick around and keep these mountain skills alive with me.